Now, a second private school has blamed Labour's tax raid for its closure. They said that it was pretty much the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a struggling school, but it was managing until this final nail in the coffin. So Keir Starmer has promised to charge private schools 20% VAT, as well as end business rates relief, if he comes into power after the general election. Now, he said he'd do that straight away. The party estimates this will raise about £1.7 billion of funds to be spent on the state school sector. Labour, however, have been urged to abandon its plans to charge VAT if Budget Watchdog forecasts that it'll ultimately lose the taxpayer money. That is, of course, the OBR. They are saying that if it does not, if it costs the taxpayer, the OBR will tell the Labour Party to abandon this plan. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak has pledged to scrap Mickey Mouse university courses such as creative arts and design and media, journalism, and communications to help fund 100,000 apprentices. Problem there is, seriously, what is a Mickey Mouse degree? Which one? Who decides? Joining me now to discuss, Jonathan and Gary. Right, I'm going to start with you, Gary Mond.
Starting with the private schools, I think this is very, very dangerous. What is going to happen is, in the first instance, there will be growing numbers of people who will not be able to afford to send their children to private schools. And these are families coming from ordinary backgrounds whose parents are probably working overtime or taking second jobs to be able to afford the actual school fees. So the first step will be we will see a decline in number of people going to private schools. Then the next step...
We've already seen that,
and that's going to accelerate.
Fewer applications already.
That's going to accelerate. And then the next step will be a number of private schools will close. And that number might be quite great. And we will see a lot of unemployment caused by teachers and others working in the private school sector losing their jobs. And this is not going to be good for the economy. And then, of course, the state sector has to absorb all those children who were going into private schools. So I don't think this has been thought through by Keir Starmer. I hope it doesn't happen. It is a potentially disastrous policy.
Well, there's also the children who then have to leave the schools, because obviously that is psychologically quite damaging if you've got to go from one school to another. Some will maybe doing GCSEs. And then there's also the prospect that actually the plan was to raise £1.7 billion, but that is based on most of these people still attending. So if you do not get those numbers, you do not make that money. And then the actual education budget is about £116 billion. So this that they will be getting is a drop in the ocean. Jonathan?
Well, I mean, what happened to the Thatcherite mantra of standing on your own 2 feet? I mean, the idea that, you know, sort of private schools should be able to survive without getting tax breaks from the government. And so, you know...
Well, aren't the parents already paying once? I mean, look, at each...
that's their choice.
Yeah, but it's not really a tax break if you're paying, say, each pupil gets about £7,500 from the taxpayer's purse, which obviously comes from a big fund that everybody's paying into. So if everybody who is, you know, adults are paying £7,500 for each kid, then they're also paying for their own children. This doesn't...
Schools are under no obligation to pass on any VAT that they are charged on to parents for a start. That's entirely within schools' remit. A lot of schools up and down the country have had to make all kinds of cutbacks through austerity in the last 14 years. And I think the majority of parents, 93%, who send their children to state schools, will have limited sympathy that sort of other parents will also...
93%? Where did you get that figure from?
I think 7% of children in this country are privately educated.
Oh, right, so you're saying 93%
well, I'm not sure. I mean,
obviously
that's not necessarily 93% of parents. I'm not saying... Obviously, look, no one is... I don't think there should be a kind of a class war issue here. But, you know, we are obviously in very, very difficult times, and governments have to make priorities. Governments have to find money. And I think that a lot of people find it unfair that private schools should have a tax break.
But this is not really... But I hear what you're saying, but just if you look at the figures, so adults are paying about £7,500 for each child in state education. That comes from a full pot that's coming from all the adults, whether they have children or not, whether you send children to private school or not. I would have thought, looking at that, if somebody is then paying for private education, actually that person should get some sort of tax break, because they are paying twice.
Look, the taxation is kind of a collective idea that we all pay into a pot, and we're all entitled to grow out of it. In the same way that sort of, you know, young people are paying for other people's pensions. I mean, that's just how things work.
So the point I'm making is that you're calling this a tax break for the school, but yet the parents will have to pay for this. Obviously, it will get past the parent, so it'll be a charge to the parents. But the bottom line is, this may not raise any money, and yet it might well cause disruption.
Well, obviously, we'll have to wait and see what the OBR says about this. But I have to question the first thing that we talked about a school closing. I mean, the last time I checked...
This is the second school.
Right, the last time I checked, Labour had not actually won the election. And so you're kind of thinking, if no VAT has been charged on that school yet...
Do you have children?
They're getting ready.
I don't have children.
Well, I think that's why you're saying that, because what happens is you book your kids into the school for the next term. So the parents are looking at that thinking, crikey, I can't afford the year, so I'm not going to enlist my child at that school.
Yeah.
So before they're even in power, and as you said yourself, the polls are showing that Labour may well have are likely to have a landslide election. We don't know, but it seems a foregone. So if that is the case, these parents are looking ahead, and that's what you do with schools. You look ahead.
But Luke, the other point, I suppose, that's related to that is that private schools are part of a capitalist society which operates within a free market. And within a free market, there's no one has a divine right to succeed in their business. Private schools are businesses. Some will succeed on their own merit, some will fail. I don't think that we should be in the business of using the state to support private enterprises necessarily.
I think we're the only country that chunked VAT on education in that way. No other country does that.
I'm just going to say there's an additional point here which hasn't been made, and that is that there's a freedom of choice element here. Yeah. That what we're doing, if we actually put VAT onto private school fees, what we're doing is we're going to make it harder for people to afford it, and the possibility being, which exists, of sending your child to private school, if you want to, will reduce.
Gary, isn't that a kind of extraordinary thing to say about freedom of choice? There might be millions of parents who would like to choose to send their children to
how they spend their money.
No, I'm sorry. It's not how they spend their money. Look, when 30 years ago, you could have a situation, much like people being able to buy a house on quite modest salary, sort of 40 or 50 years ago. A lot of people were able to send their kids to private school because it wasn't reserved for the extremely wealthy. The private school fees have gone up way above inflation over the last few years.
That's true.
It's now out of the range of a lot of middle-class professionals in a way that it wasn't.
Can I just say, this school, though, is most of the kids have special education needs, so a lot of the private schools aren't necessarily
and I think they'll have
the Eatons and things.
No,
that's not really what's been coming through, and it looks as though this school, some of them were struggling, but it does seem to be this is the straw that broke the camel's back. But finally, very briefly to you, Gary, what should Sir Keir Starmer be saying though? Because this is obviously a way of funding education. That's his plan. It could fund 1.7 billion.
There are many other areas across the economy where cuts can be made to fund education. Many areas. I mean, for example, in overseas aid, in a complete review of the NHS, we're spending £180 billion a year on the NHS, and I think that there's never been a proper review, an efficiency review of the spending in the NHS. That there's so many areas where cuts can be made. This, to actually use the politics of envy, because this is what's involved here, the politics of envy, in regard to making it so much harder for parents to send their children to a private school if they want to, is not the way forward.
It's not the politics of envy.